Hello, welcome back to the Fruit of Grisaia. In the end, Kaneda and Komori never did succeed in getting the kite into the sky, and later that day, Mr. Ochi told me that it probably wouldn't have achieved much anyway. We were geographically quite close to the town Mr. Ochi had been born and raised in, and from what he said, the cell phone reception in the whole area was notoriously awful. What's more, take a look at a map, and there's a nicely paved national highway running straight through this region, but we've fallen while driving down an old back road. Apparently it was in frequent use when Mr. Ochi was a student here, but nowadays almost no one takes it without some specific and compelling reason. He'd chosen it as a detour, concerned about traffic on the highway heading home. Unfortunately, the entrance to the road was narrow and inconspicuous, and because of the poor condition of the surface, it was sealed off every time heavy rain fell. As a result, the traffic was extremely light. In the first place, we wouldn't have plunged off the road if there had been a proper guardrail on that tight curve. Even if we got a cell phone well above the cliff, there's a good chance it wouldn't pick up a signal. I thought we should probably pass on this information to Kaneda and Komori, who were even then absorbed in repairing their almost certainly useless kite. When I suggested as much, however, Kazuki frowned and told me to let it be. Rather than wasting effort on a losing bet, wouldn't it be more effective to have them trying out something else? In response to that question, Kazuki smirked slightly, cocked her head slightly to the side, and asked me if I was willing to hear about a bit of complicated stuff. That lately mocking body language of hers was getting on my nerves, but I agreed to listen, after stressing my request for the clear and concise version, of course.
私たちがここに来てまだ2日目よ。今はまだ拡散期です。つまり、今は多くの無駄を重ねて加減を学ぶ時期なの。放っておいても、そのうち勝手に学んで無駄をしなくなるわよ。
To summarize, we were newborn infants relative to this environment. We needed to be allowed to wail, wriggle around aimlessly, and pop things into our mouths. Otherwise, our maturation process would be crippled, apparently. I sort of understood what Kazuki was getting at, but when I thought about how those two would feel when they discovered their hard work had been in vain, I couldn't help wanting to let them know. Turning my back on Kazuki, I walked over to Kaneda-senpai. She was perched on a moderately sized rock, her brow furrowed with earnest concentration as she tried to untangle a complex clump of fishing line.
あ？うん、まあ知ってたよ。
Kaneda received my hesitant advice with unexpected composure.
佐久間先輩からそんな話は聞いてたしね。
佐久間先輩から？
I turned around to face the person in question, still tirelessly flinging her battered cell phone high into the air a few meters away.
どういうことです？
ああ、実は上の道路にいた時から県外だってのは分かってたんだ。
Slightly before the bus plunged off the cliff, Sakuma had casually opened her cell phone to check the time and noticed the words "no signal" in the corner of the screen. She even remembered worrying idly about how we would call the police if we got in an accident out here.
じゃあ、電波が入らないことを知っていて、それでも携帯を投げ続けていたってことですか？
まあそうなるかな。でも絶対に入らないと決まったわけじゃないし、たまたま私の携帯が県外だっただけで、他の携帯、他のキャリアなら入るかもしれないだろ。
For that reason, she decided to try borrowing Ibuki's phone, a different model on a different network, and tossing it instead. But Ibuki said if anyone was going to throw her cell phone around, It was going to be her. In the end, the two of them ended up out here, tossing and picking up their phones together.
結局のところ伊吹の携帯でもダメっぽいんだけど、ほら私はこんな性格だからさ。無駄だって頭じゃ分かっていても体を動かしてないと落ち着かないんだ。そういう勝負なんだよ。
Thinking back, Sakuma had approached basketball with a similar mindset. No matter how overwhelming our opponent in the next match, she would practice diligently, even knowing we would lose, even when she was the only one left in the gym. She'd keep right on going.
バスケの試合にしたってそうだけど、やれることはあったのにっていう後悔が一番悔しいと私は思うんだ。どうせ負けるにしろ、やるだけのことをやった上での敗北なら勝利はなくても満足は得られるし、その次につながるだろ。
Words very typical of Sakuma, well known in our team for her silent dedication. She stood out for her skill, but had apparently removed herself from consideration for the captaincy, preferring to avoid placing herself above others. However, there was one person whose mood took a rapid, obvious turn for the sour at this little speech, her roommate in the dorm and partner in the valley, Ibuki.
私はクマ先輩のそういう無駄に暑苦しいところとか苦手です。それに電波が入らないって話、私は聞いてませんよ。
Ibuki had been drafted into this exercise in futility without her knowledge. Judging from the way she was biting her oil and squeezing her cell phone tightly in her hands, she wasn't happy about it. The girl had a tendency to complain fairly easily, a trait that often left her somewhat isolated from the group in both the classroom and on the team.
あれ？言ってなかったっけ？
そういう大雑把で忘れっぽいところも嫌いです。
悪かったよ、ブッキー。
With those words, Sakuma casually slipped her hand around Ibuki's waist, drew the younger girl close, and rested her chin on top of Ibuki's head.
ウッキーって呼ばないでください。
Pouting, Ibuki mumbled that even her classmates had started to pick up that stupid nickname. Apparently, even seemingly mismatched individuals could develop some fairly intimate bonds given enough time together. Staring at the two of them, I entertained some idle speculation about which one would be wearing the pants, not even noticing my cheeks growing hot. Apparently, my trivial delusions were showing pretty clearly on my face, as Sakuma gave me a broad, almost boastful grin.
だから言っただろ？君たちが思っているほど私たちは仲が悪いわけじゃないってさ。君の相方はどうした？あの風見って子は放っておくとへそを曲げてすね始めるタイプだと思うよ。
まさかあの和樹ですよ。
Kazami Kazuki didn't need anyone's attention. To her, I was nothing but a personal chef, a convenient servant girl, an occasional object of amusement. And if Kazuki really needed to, I was pretty sure she could pick up cooking quickly enough. Give her a while and she'd probably be good enough to leave me very nearly worthless.
わかっちゃいないね。全然だよ、スオーアマネ。だったら君はどうしてあの風見和樹とのペアを選んだんだい？
それは
Pick her? I didn't really have a choice in the matter. As for why things turned out that way, it was probably because we both realized I was the only person on the team capable of putting up with that fiercely unique personality of hers.
じゃあさ、風見に同じ質問をされたとき、こう答えてみればいいよ。
As Sakuma leaned over to whisper in my ear, I caught a strong whiff of the refreshing, citrusy scent of her body. The way her breath tickled my ear as she spoke didn't help either. I froze stiff as a statue, unable to really focus on processing the meaning of her words.
それでバッチリ。風見が君のことをどう思っているかはっきりとわかると思うよ。でも強い言葉だからあまり頻発しない方がいいと思うな。それが私からのアドバイス。
はあ、さようで。
I didn't really get it, to be honest. It felt like the most likely outcome would be Kazuki laughing in my face. Then again, it probably couldn't really hurt to give it a shot sometime, if I happened to remember.
ほら、お姫様がへそを曲げる前に戻りなよ。
お姫様ね。
Not that I found Sakuma's theory particularly convincing, but I did decide to head back in search of Kazuki. However, her shoes weren't in front of our tent. I took a quick look inside anyway, but there was no sign of her. What's this? Where'd she get to now? Well, Sakuma may not have been too far off the mark. Leaving Kazuki unattended for so long didn't seem to be the best idea, considering this habit of casually strolling off without a word. Don't tell me she's wandered off into the forest again. Maybe she was actually doing this on purpose, waiting for me to come looking for her. No, I was definitely reading too much into this now. That said, there was no reason to think Kazuki was coming back anytime soon, and considering that blunt personality of hers, the longer I left her to her own devices, the more likely she'd end up quarreling and causing us trouble. After heaving a little sigh and mumbling a few complaints about my nuisance of a partner, I ended up trotting off in search of her like the hopeless soft touch I was. As it turned out, though, my search wasn't a particularly arduous one. Kazuki's whereabouts came to light within 2 minutes. I discovered her shoes lying neatly side by side in front of the largest structure in our camp, the conspicuous 6-person tent.
和樹、いるの？
When dealing with the tent, knocking isn't exactly an option, so I hesitantly called out to her through the door.
いるわ。入っていらっしゃいな。
As instructed, I removed my shoes and crawled into the tent. The interior was dimly lit, muggy, and filled with the overpowering stench of disinfectant and sweat. I let out a small, reflexive groan in dismay.
どうだった？電波の話。金田さんたちに伝えた？
Even as Kazuki spoke, she was applying disinfectant to Sakurai's wounded stomach. Maybe the gloomy lighting had something to do with it, but the gash across Sakurai's abdomen and the rough fishing line stitches holding it shut seemed all the more gruesome today, to the point I could barely stand to look at it.
悪いけど、手すきのようなら広岡さんの額のタオルを変えてあげてもらえる？
わかった。
I turned to the other side of the tent as requested. Hiroka-san was lying nearby with a damp towel on her forehead, repeating long, deep breaths. Her eyes were squeezed tightly shut. It was obvious at a glance that she was still suffering from the fever brought on by breaking both her legs. The howls and moans which had continued throughout the night had gone quiet that morning, so I had assumed her condition had improved, but it was clear to me now that she simply lost the physical strength to scream.
Hiroka san, 大丈夫?
Anyone with a set of functional eyes could tell in a second that she wasn't remotely alright, but I couldn't find anything else to say. When I took the towel from her forehead, it was burning with such heat that it could have been resting on a hot iron plate. She was drawing regular, repeated breath, but there was no response whatsoever to my question. Although she seemed to be awake, she didn't seem fully conscious of her surroundings. Soaking the hot towel in a plastic bag filled with cold water, I gave it a very light squeeze and replaced it on Hiroka-san's forehead.
ありがとう風見さん。
私じゃないわ。今あなたを見ているのは周防あまねよ。
ありがとうスオさん。
そう、意識をしっかりね。呼吸のタイミングを忘れないように。
ごめんね。
いいのよ。
Kazuki kept up her conversation with Hiroka-san without even turning around. In that moment, watching the silhouette of her back in that dim tent was strangely reassuring to me. There was something strong, almost dignified about her just then, as though she were some famous physician, utterly confident in her role. Having completed her disinfection of Sakurai's wound, Kazuki began to quickly wind the bandages back into place, speaking in an ice-cold voice as she worked.
桜井さん、包帯で蒸し暑い上に縫った傷がかゆいのはわかりますが、かきむしらないでください。かゆみというのは軽微な痛みのことです。かゆいということは治癒が進んでいる証拠なのですから、どんなにかゆくても我慢してください。
はい、ごめんなさい。
どうしても我慢できないときは呼んでください。その時はまた消毒します。
わかりました。ありがとう。
また後で様子を見に来ます。
With those words, Kazuki crawled out of the tent, signaling for me to follow with a glance.
包帯を洗いに行こうと思うのだけれど、私はうまく手が使えないから、あなた付き合ってもらえる？
それは構わないけど。
じゃあ行きましょう。
I caught a quick glimpse of long strips of cloth blackened with blood in Kazuki's hands, presumably Sakurai-san's old bandages, but in the next moment she turned her back on me and abruptly began to walk off. What was this? She seemed to be in something of a bad mood. Unfortunately, it was a little difficult to tell for sure in Kazuki's case, as she was more than a bit brusque at the best of times.
広岡さんと桜井さんの状態はどうなのか。それが聞きたいんじゃなくて。できれば彼女たちには聞かれたくないの。移動しながら話しましょう。
分かった。
Well, that explained the sudden exit. Kazuki's estimate of the medical situation wasn't as pessimistic as I had feared. Sakurai's abdominal laceration was apparently healing relatively steadily. The larger problem was Hiroka-san and her fractured legs. Although Kazuki had straightened her legs, pulling both limbs into place and fixed them with makeshift splints, the blazing favor that accompanied the injuries showed no signs of receding. Oh no. I just failed reading all of that. Hiroka-san wasn't exactly what you could call robust or sturdy to begin with. At present, she'd weakened to the point that her body was incapable of accepting the nourishment it needed to heal. They tried to feed her a light soup, even crushing the small chunks of potato with a spoon to make them easier to swallow, but after swallowing a mere 3 mouthfuls, she insisted she was completely full. And continuing to feed her regardless only resulted in her vomiting back the entire meal.
それでも安静にしていれば少しずつ回復に向かうとは思うけれど、難しいわね。
時間がかかるってこと？
それもあるけれど、薬が絶対的に足りないわ。
Our only source of medical supplies was a single first aid kit we kept on hand to treat scrapes during practice. Although we were well stocked in band-aids, disinfectant, and pain-relieving patches, we lacked antibiotics to prevent lacerations from festering, and drugs to bring down the agonizing inflammation caused by bone fractures.
彼女たちは自分たちが集団の中で負担になっていることを気にしているわ。 わざとらしく優しく接すると彼女たちの自責に拍車をかけかねないから、できるだけ自然に接してあげた方がいいわ。
What does this say? Ay, ay. And that would explain why she seemed oddly impassive back there, I guess. Well, I had to admit it would probably be exceptionally creepy to have Kazami Kazuki of all people treating me with tender compassion.
それであなたの方はどうだったの？携帯電話の電波が入らない可能性があることを金田小森のペアに伝えに行ったのでしょ？
彼女たちそのことを知っていたみたい。
そう。
無駄かもしれないと分かっていても、他に何もすることがないし、可能性もゼロじゃないからって。それと佐久間先輩からの新情報だけど、上の道路でも携帯は圏外だったみたい。先生も先輩もなんでもっと早く言ってくれなかったのかな。
電波の入りが悪かったのは先生が学生の頃の話だから、今は改善されている可能性もあるという希望を残しておきたかったのかもしれないわね。それにこんな状況でしょ？先生としてもなるべくネガティブな意見は口にしたくなかったんじゃないかしら。
気持ちはわかるけど、そういう情報って早めに出し合った方がいいと思うな。それに変にペアなんか組まずにみんなで一丸になって情報を出し合ったり、仕事を分散した方が効率がいいと思うけど。
This whole idea of dividing ourselves into pairs that would operate independently had been Kazuki's suggestion. It's true that the difficulty of keeping everyone supervised was dramatically reduced under this system, since everyone would naturally be keeping an eye on their partner, but that was pretty much the only benefit I could see. Everyone cooperating seemed more likely to produce good ideas, and it felt like operating in one large group would reduce the weight any given individual was carrying on their shoulders.
それがそうでもないのよね。意見の数が増えるだけではまとまりに欠けるし、負担が減りすぎる個体が出てくるのもまた問題なのよ。
どういうこと？負担が減りすぎる？
あまね、あなた働きありの法則って知ってる？
知らない。何それ？あり？
話すと長いから選択しながら説明しましょう。
Apparently, Kazuki had pushed us to adopt this pair system, with all its seeming drawbacks, in an attempt to avoid a specific organizational problem known as the worker ant principle. It was obvious she was fully prepared to give me another headache-inducing lecture, so I asked her to give me the short version, which went something like this. Within any relatively organized group, the appearance of individuals who toil diligently at their job tends to be counteracted by others beginning to neglect their work. For example, in ant society. Inside a colony, an organization operating under the leadership of a queen ant, there are apparently not only the familiar worker ants, but also a sizable population of slacker ants that spend most of their time wandering around aimlessly. If you pick out all the hardworking ants who take their duties seriously and place them in a brand new colony, a fairly consistent percentage will lose their previous enthusiasm and transform into slackers. And back in the old nest, where all the hard workers have suddenly vanished, a good chunk of the slacker ants will soon begin throwing themselves vigorously into their work. It's apparently a well-observed phenomenon. This principle isn't limited to ants alone. It applies to human societies as well. This natural tendency to lean heavily on the overachievers makes efficiently managing an organization in the long term much more difficult than one might imagine. By dividing us into pairs, the colony was decentralized. Everyone was essentially forced to help their partner, making it harder to coast along as a slacker. On top of which, it would be possible to encourage competition between the small groups, producing a meteoric rise in net productivity per capita, or something. I did more or less understand what she was trying to say, but to be perfectly honest, I couldn't shake the feeling she was just deftly pulling the wool over my eyes.
つまりちゃんとした意味があってペア制度を採用しているってこと？
そういうこと。今はそのメリットをあまり感じ取れないかもしれないけれど、そうね。例えば集団の中で喧嘩が発生した時とか、その意味が見えてくると思うわ。
よくわからないけど、和樹がそういうのならそうなんでしょうね。
なんだかそれ、あまり好きではない言いようだわ。言いたいことや不満があれば遠慮なく言いなさいと言ったでしょ。
ごめん、別に不満とか思ってないし、ただ和樹の言うことなら間違いないかなって、そういう意味で言っただけだよ。
あなたは私の奴隷ではなくお友達でしょ。それともそんな風に思っているのは私だけ？もしそうならそれはあまりにも悲しいわ。
怒らないでよ、別に皮肉を言ったつもりもないんだし。
もしあなたが私とのペアに不満があるのなら他のことを変わってくれても構わないのよ。
その言い草こそ傷つくな。あなたこそ別に私じゃなくても便利な女なら誰でもいいのね。
そうは言っていないでしょ。
そう聞こえたもの。あなたこそ私とのペアに不満を。
All of a sudden, the words Sakuma had whispered into my ear popped vividly into my mind.
何？あって。だいたいあなた、どうして私とのペアなんて受け入れたの？
それはね、和樹のことがはい。だからこのメンバーの中で私は和樹のことが一番好きだからあなたとペアを組んだの。
そう。
和樹は私のこと
包帯を洗わなきゃ。
和樹
Was this really happening? Kazami Kazuki flustered with embarrassment. Amazing, Sakuma-senpai, it really works. I'll give a testimonial for your infomercial.
ねえ、和樹、私のこと好きなんでしょ？
うるさい。私は今忙しいのよ。くだらないことを話している暇があったら手伝ってほしいのだけれど。
ごまかした。図星なのね。
図星とかそういう、どうしてそんな言い方をするの？言わなくてもわかることでしょ。
和樹。
She was so ridiculously adorable that I just couldn't help myself. Sneaking up behind Kazuki, I gently rested my hands on her shoulders, then leaned forward and nuzzled my nose against the back of her head. With a hysterical little shriek that could only be described as alarmingly out of character, Kazuki jerked forward, lost her balance, and pitched face first into the marshy stream.
カズキごめん、大丈夫？あなた、自分には同性愛の趣味はないって言ってなかったかしら？
Did she say she likes
いや、
him
な
that way?
いけどさ。でも今はそれも悪くないかなってちょっと思ってる。そう、あなたと
うかつだったわ。いい？あなたが今感じているその感情は吊り橋効果で説明ができます。落ち着いて、もう一度自分の中の感情を整理してみま
I
しょう。
think she just likes him as a friend.
服濡れちゃったね。脱がしてあげる。
いや、落ち着いて、そこは動かないで。それ以上近づいたら悲鳴をあげるわよ。
ごめんごめん、冗談だってば。
冗談？
だから私にそっちの趣味なんて本当にないから安心して。ほら、いつまでも冷たい水の中に座ってると風邪ひいちゃうよ。ほら、手を出して。
Ignoring Kazuki's bitter scowl, I offered my hand, which she accepted with a great show of reluctance.
ひどい目にあったわ。
だからごめんって、冗談が過ぎたよ。
あなたの冗談は笑えないわ。
I don't know why she understood it like that.
おお、和樹の口からそんなセリフが聞ける日が来るとは長生きはするもんだよね。
言ってなさい。私をいじめると夜中にお化けが来るんだから。
やめてよ、夜おトイレに行けなくなっちゃうじゃない。
そもそもここにはトイレなんてないわよ。
機嫌直してよね。さっきのは確かに冗談だけど、私が和樹のことを好きだっていうの。
どうせ誰か悪い先輩にでもそう言えって入れ知恵されたのでしょ。いいからさっさと洗濯を済ませてしまいましょう。
もうそういうこと言う子は可愛くないぞ、和樹。
生まれてこの方可愛いなんて母親にも言われたことなんてないわ。
あ、ちょっと和樹、制服は脱がないでいいの？
大丈夫よ、夏だしすぐに乾くわ。
胸が小さくても笑ったりしないよ。
どうしてあなたはそういうことを平気で言うの？なんだかあなた最初の頃とずいぶんキャラクターが変わってきていない？
もともと私はこういうキャラだし、あなたという存在に慣れてきたってことじゃないかな。
そうやって私をおもちゃにしてればいいのよ。いつか罰が当たるんだから。って
何、どうしたの？犬？
I looked down to find a toy breed dog at Kazuki's feet, rubbing its face up against her legs and snuffling in evident curiosity.
これって小森さんの飼っている犬？
そうみたいね。
何？和樹って犬が苦手なの？
そうじゃないけど、急に茂みの中から飛び出してきたからびっくりしたわ。
飼い主は？小森さんはいないの？この子一人でここまで来たのかな？
そうみたいね。喉が渇いているみたいだから水の匂いをたどってここまで来たのかもしれない。
そっか。じゃあちょっと待ってて、今お水汲んであげる。
やめた方がいいわ。
どうして？
この手の品種改良が施された小型犬は内臓が弱いことがあるし、飼い主の許可なく生水はあげない方がいいわよ。
あ、そうなんだ。でも私 昨日からここのお水ガブガブ飲んでるけど全然平気。
あなたは見るからに健康だし、生水ぐらい全然平気だと思うけれど、この子は見るからに繊細そうだから、一度煮沸してから飲ませた方がいいんじゃないかしら。
その言葉何気に傷つくぞ。
キャンプに戻れば煮沸済みのお水があるから、それをあげましょう。我慢できる？
Although it almost certainly didn't have the first clue what Kazuki's words meant, the little dog responded with a high-pitched bark and began wagging its tail happily.
そう、いい子ね。
嘘、カズキって犬と会話するキャラ？
あのね、私だって一応そういう女の子らしい一面だってあるわよ。
まあ、わかるような気もする。
Kazuki did seem likely to turn into one of those hard-working career women, the hard middle manager in a pantsuit who ends up blazing right past marriageable age without sparing the time for manly. And this was exactly the sort of dog she'd be keeping in her apartment to help distract from the loneliness of her existence. Working like a maniac during the day, chewing out her male underlings at every opportunity, earning the intimidated awe of the other women, getting herself the ignominious title Tyrant Queen of the Office. Then rushing home to her apartment at night, greeting the fluffy ball fur waiting at the front door with a sugary "Mommy's home, Poopsie" or something. Then proceeded to pamper it with gourmet meals, maybe even dressing it up in little sweaters, keeping up a simpering stream of baby talk all the while.
今私、あなたのリアルな未来を少しだけ想像して、ちょっと涙が出そうになったわ。
そう、一体どんな未来を想像したのか詳しく聞いてみたい気もするけれど、聞かない方が心の健康には良さそうね。とりあえず包帯も洗い終わったし、戻りましょうか。この子も飼い主のところに連れて行かないといけないし。
With those words, Kazuki bent down and scooped up the dog, pulling at her feet into her arms.
あ、カズキ、片手じゃ大変でしょ？ワンちゃん私が預かるよ。
そう？じゃあお願い。
あれ？なんか嫌がってる？ほらワンちゃん、こっちおいで。どうしたの？
あまね、あなた犬に嫌われるタイプ？
おかしいな。そんなことないと思うんだけど。っていうか、逆にカズキはどうしてそんなにその子に懐かれてるの？前からお友達？
いいえ、小森さんが犬を飼っているのは知っていたけど、見たのは初めてだし、名前だって知らないわ。
Komori's love for dogs was well known among the team members, and I'd heard about her puppy, but this was my first time seeing it as well. Komori had been so anxious and lonely at the prospect of being separated from her dog during the sleepaway training camp that she ended up smuggling it in with her. At the planning meeting before the trip, she timidly tried asking the captain for official permission to take her pet along as a companion, but naturally the answer was a curt, "School trips are not your personal vacation." But Komori simply couldn't bring herself to leave the puppy behind. In the end, she decided to hide the animal in her sports bag, then apologized once we arrived at the campground and the deal was done.
この犬、なんて種類だっけ？マルチーズ？
シーズーでしょ？あなた、小型犬は何でもマルチーズに見えるの？
だって、小型犬なんてマルチーズかチワワぐらいしか知らないもの。あとトイプードル？
どうでもいいからこの子を受け取ってよ。結構重いわ。
いや、わかってるんだけどね。
When I reached out toward it, the tiny dog bared its fangs and gave a sharp bark of warning.
なんか、むっちゃ嫌われてるんですけど、 なんで？
何か悪いことでもしたの？この子の餌を盗み食いしたとか。
カズキ、あんたもしかして私を食いしん坊キャラにしようとしているの？
If anything, dogs tended to like me, and I didn't remember mistreating this animal in the 5 minutes I'd known it. It almost felt like, rather than having a problem with me in particular, the dog just didn't want to be carried by anyone other than Kazuki.
もしかしてこの子、カズキのことを群れのボスだと思ってる？
はい？ああ、犬は飼われている家の中でボスを決めるっていうあれのこと？
うん、そう。多分だけど、この子は群れのボスを本能で嗅ぎ分けてるんじゃないかな。
それがどうして私なの？私より偉そうな人間なんて他にもいるでしょうに。
それ素で言ってるからカズキってすごいよね。
何が？
That dog seemed to have recognized Kazuki as the alpha of the pack, not the captain, not our teacher. Titles don't mean much to an animal, but they're sensitive to confidence, pride, and bossiness. And to be honest, I don't think there were many people who could compete with Kazuki on any of those fronts.
とにかくこの犬は私が連れて行けばいいのね。まったく飼い主は何をしているのかしら。
In the next moment, as if to answer Kazuki's mild mutters of complaint, we heard the panicked voice of the girl in question.
あの声、小森さんの声だよね。もしかしてアーくんってこのチワワのこと？
だからシーズーだってば。
小森さん、こっちこっち、こっちにいるよ。
うるさ、急に大きな声を出さないでよ。
あ、ごめん。なんかカズキってさ、大きな音。
私はあなたと違って体も小さいし繊細なのよ。
あのさ、その私が大雑把で無神経な女って設定やめてもらっていいかな？
アリオンならここにいるわよ。
The instant Kazuki lowered the dog to the ground, it trotted over to Komori-san and jumped into her waiting arms.
よかった。急に姿が見えなくなったから心配しちゃった。
ねえ、アリオンって？
その犬の名前よ。
なんで名前知ってるの？さっきは知らないって言ってなかった？そうか、アーくんって呼びながら名前を推理したとか？
首輪よ。さっき見たら首輪のプレートにアリオンって。
あ、そうなんだ。なんだ。
あのね、いくら私でもアーくんからアリオンを推理するのは無理だと思うわよ。あまり私を超人だと思わないでね。
なんかカズキの場合、その人の好きな数字を聞いただけでその人の人生を10年先まで言い当てそうな気もするのよね。
あなた、私のことを妖怪か何かと勘違いしてない？
いや、さすがの私もそこまでは言ってないけどさ。
That said, if someone were to tell me they'd seen her brewing potions in a cauldron by moonlight, I don't think I would have dismissed the story out of hand.
見つけてくれてありがとう。ちょっと目を離している隙にいなくなってしまって、ずっと探していたの。
その子、喉が渇いているみたいだけど、あなたちゃんとお水あげてる？
でもこの子お腹が弱いから専用のお水しか飲めないし、この子のために持ってきたお水も。もしかしてこの子にそこのお水飲ませちゃった？
いいえ、飼い主の許可もなく勝手に生水を飲ませない方がいいと思ったから飲ませなかったわ。
さあ、よ
いいのよ。私も犬は好きだし。可愛い子ね。男の子？
そうなの。この子のお母さんっていうのが去年のドッグショーで国内2位になったダイアナで、お父さんが
It seems like it's going to last a while. For the disinterested layperson, listening to the prideful boasts of a dog fancier is sheer agony. Well then, how can I make my escape? Maybe I should just counterpunch and start lecturing these two about the relative merits of the T27 and 510 Bluebird, but as I was heavily pondering on these matters. From the sky above, the quiet forest, usually silent for the cries of birds and the whispering of branches, there came a soft but distinctive sound of propeller blades tearing through air.
カズキ。この音ってヘリだよ。ヘリコプターの音だ。戻ってみんなに知らせなきゃ。急ごう。
We broke into a desperate run, craning our necks to watch the sky through cracks in the trees. The sound of the helicopter's rotor blades grew louder by the second. Soon, even the howling of its turboshaft engine was perceptible through the din. Knowing that it was coming closer by the moment, we couldn't help but shout pointlessly for their attention. When we reached the camp, everyone had already gathered underneath an opening in the canopy. Waving their arms furiously, they shouted to the sky. Hey, down here! Our voices were powerless, but still we rubbed our throats raw. Some of the group was frantically gathering whatever wood and grass they could, using old magazines from the bus as kindling in an attempt to produce smoke. Others were picking up baseball-sized stones from the ground and throwing them into the sky with all their might, even knowing it was futile. This isn't enough. We need something to really announce our presence. I sprinted to the bottom of the ravine, my legs burning with exertion. Crawling into our overturned bus, I stumbled frantically down its length to the driver's seat. At my first violent twist, the key caught stubbornly in the ignition and refused to turn. After a few fumbling moments, I pulled the key all the way out, then jammed it firmly back in. After what seemed like an eternity, the cylinder finally moved to on. Please notice. I pressed down on the horn button at the center of the steering wheel with all the strength I could muster. A grating electronic sound echoed in the air, shaking my eardrums, but all too quickly the powerful blast of the horn ate away at what little charge was left in the battery. The volume decreased with every passing second. And as the helicopter slowly passed overhead, the droning of its blades all but erased every other sound in the valley. Soon enough, that noise diminished into the distance and was gone. We did what we could. We tried everything, but there was no way to know if it had been enough. What? No!
どうだった？
No!
こっちに気がついた？そんなのわかんないよ。でも右に向かって飛んでいたのにこちらに向かって進路を変えましたよね。それってこちらの存在に気がついたってことじゃないんですか？だったらなぜ飛び去ったのよ。気がついたのなら戻ってくるか、この上を旋回したりするんじゃないの？
あれは私たちを探しに来たヘリじゃなくて、どこか民間のヘリなのかもしれません。こちらに気がついたのなら無線とかで連絡を取っているかもしれないじゃないですか。そうですよ。それに燃料が残り少なくて一旦戻っただけかもしれません。またすぐに戻ってくるんですよ。きっとそうです。
In that moment, we were all united in a surge of hope. It wasn't just the prospect of immediate salvation. We had spent nearly 2 full days in this place, an isolated island devoid of any hint of human presence. It was beginning to feel as though the rest of the human race might just have vanished from the earth in the instant we plunged off that cliff, and then that helicopter passed by. Even if they didn't notice us this time, another chance would come. We weren't stranded on some uncharted island. We were within eyeshot of a road that connected to the normal world, where our normal lives were waiting for us. Another chance would definitely come. Everyone believes that, unquestioningly. No! We watched the sky until it grew dark. Evening arrived with surprising swiftness. So close. In the end, the helicopter did not return that day.
ねえカズキ、あのヘリって何だったのかな。
さあ、あまり詳しくはないけれど、タンデムローター機だったみたいだし、CH47 とかいうやつじゃないかしら。
いや、機種が知りたいわけじゃなくってさ。
ああ、つまり私たちの救助に来たヘリなのか、それとも偶然通りかかった民間のヘリなのか、それが気になるのね。
うん、まあそういうことになるのかな。
おそらく後者でしょうね。あの手のヘリを所有運用しているのは米軍か自衛隊か。どちらにせよ私たちを探しに来たヘリではなく、偶然通りかかっただけだと思うわ。
やっぱりそうなんだ。
落ち込むことはないわ。またいずれこの上を通ることもあるでしょうし、その時は今度こそ無視できないようにすればいいのよ。
具体的にはどうするの？
そうね、今日あのヘリが来た時、佐久間さんがヘリに向かって石を投げていたでしょ。
全然届かなかったけどね。
だから次の機会までに森で木を切り倒して投石機を作りましょう。どうせなら人が投げられないぐらい大きい岩を飛ばしてぶつけてやれば嫌でも気がつくんじゃないかしら。
そんなのもし本当に当たったら墜落しちゃうんじゃん。
好都合じゃない。撃墜すれば墜落機を捜索するために何機もヘリが来るわ。全部落としてやりましょう。
いや、だから落としてどうするのよ。助けてもらおうよ。
それが私のスパルタ式ジョークってやつよ。
うふふじゃねえよ。
Not funny, Kazuki. Oh, it's quite funny. You're one to complain about my jokes being in bad taste. When I closed my eyes for a moment in exasperation, my head drooped to the side. My body was urging me to collapse. That was more than enough for tonight. Tomorrow would probably be another brutally hot day. But for the moment, the night breeze was chilly against my skin. Following Kazuki into our tent, I wrapped myself tightly in my sleeping bag, and within minutes sunk like a stone into oblivion. I don't know what they're going to do. Is there a good way to get their attention at all? There has to be something. Jeez. Third day in the valley when society slumps into an economic recession, it seems higher achieving graduates from the elite universities often have an even harder time finding employment than their less brilliant peers. Normally you'd think businesses facing difficult times would want skilled employees to help them turn things around, but okay. Bye.